Guten Tag und herzlich willkommen zum Monopol-Talk auf der Art Karlsruhe. Ich habe das große Vergnügen und die große Freude, heute zum zweiten Mal nach dem Talk mit Christian Jamuschek und Olga Blass eben in die Zukunft zu schauen. Diesmal geht es um die Frage, welche Kunstinstitutionen braucht die Stadt? Mein Name ist Silke Hohmann und ich freue mich, dieser Frage, welche Kunstinstitution braucht die Stadt, nachzugehen mit zwei Persönlichkeiten, auf die die Kunstwelt einerseits und Karlsruhe andererseits und alles dazwischen, glaube ich, sehr neugierig ist, weil sie gerade erst beide beginnen, diese Stadt mit ihren Ideen und mit ihren Visionen zu formen und zu bereichern. Stefanie Patruno absolvierte an der Ruprecht-Karls-Universität in Heidelberg ein Studium der Kunstgeschichte, der klassischen Archäologie und Byzantinistik und promovierte über Thomas Hirschhorn im Kontext künstlerischer Strategien im öffentlichen Raum in Bonn. Ihre Museumslaufbahn begann 2005 an der Kunsthalle Mannheim und später zeichnete sie dort als Ausstellungskuratorin und Sammlungskustodin für die Bereiche Skulptur, Fotografie und neue Medien verantwortlich. Von Juni 2016 war sie in Darmstadt an der Mathildenhöhe und seit einem Jahr leitet sie die Städtische Galerie Karlsruhe, die sozusagen Sie werden es kennen, das Kunstmuseum für moderne und für Gegenwartskunst in Karlsruhe ist, mit einer Sammlung von beeindruckenden 20.000 Werken und dem Schwerpunkt Malerei und Fotografie. Alistair Hudson ist ein erfahrener international tätiger Kurator und Museumsleiter, der fundiertes Wissen zu den Medienkünsten mitbringt. Von 2018 bis 2022 leitete er als Direktor 2 Museen in Manchester. Er war Mitglied einer Vielzahl von Gremien, unter anderem der Turner Prize Jury sowie dem Auswahlgremium für den britischen Pavillon der Biennale von Venedig 2022. Zusammen mit der kubanischen Künstlerin Tania Bruguera leitet Alistair Hudson die Association des Arts Utiles, ein internationales Netzwerk, das sich mit dem Konzept des Useful Museum beschäftigt. Das Netzwerk engagiert sich dafür, Kunst- und Kulturinstitutionen als Orte gesellschaftlicher Verantwortung und Veränderung zu verstehen. Und seit wenigen Wochen leitet er das ZKM. Darum freue ich mich ganz besonders. A warm welcome and thanks for being here, Stefanie Patruno and Alistair Hudson. Mr. Hudson, you have worked internationally in the field of art. I'm switching. Wechsle jetzt ins Englische. Wir werden das ein bisschen mixen, aber ja, kriegen wir schon hin. Einverstanden? Ja, danke. Mr. Hudson, you have worked internationally in the field of the arts. Your last stop was Manchester, which is a city that I think owes a lot to culture and art during the last 20 years, right? It was important for the development of the city, like a really important instrument. Please tell us a bit where you professionally come from, about the things that you did until today and what role art plays in your life.
Oh gosh, it's a long story. I'll give you the short version.
Yes, please.
Well, I used to after I studied, I worked for 7 years in a commercial art gallery in London, one of the big blue chip art galleries, Anthony Doffé Gallery, representing artists like Gerhard Richter, Anselm Kiefer, George Baselitz, all these big names of art.
German big names, yeah.
German big names, a lot of American names, a lot of European names, but it gives at the time it was one of the big world commercial galleries, and we used to do lots of fairs like this in Basel and Chicago, but it was essentially, if I can talk quietly, it was essentially selling luxury goods to rich people. And whilst that was really amazing, an incredible opportunity to work with the most amazing names in art, as a young person you could imagine working with your kind of heroes, I suppose, it made me realize what I didn't want art to be. And I had this social conscience in my head, probably to do with my upbringing in a socialist household in Manchester, that I really wanted to work with art in a way that would really have a transformative effect in the world. And so after that kind of education of working in the commercial sector, I flipped. And I got a job as a curator doing public commissions for the British government in government buildings around the world. And this was really interesting for me because it was getting art to work in places where people weren't interested in art. So you had to make the art count, and you had to make it work politically, socially, educationally. And this really sowed a seed in my head about the kind of trajectory I wanted to pursue and what I actually thought art was. And for me, this began the process of thinking about art as an instrument, as a tool, as a process, rather than a set of objects in the world. And that led me to run a residency program in the mountains, in the Lake District in the north of England, which is like a mini Alps, very old tourist destination going back to Victorian times. But again, working in small village communities with contemporary artists where people didn't care about art, and trying to get art to work in really positive ways in communities like that. So that's really where me and my kind of fellow travelers, you might say, coined this idea of arte útil, or useful art. So people understood art for what it could do for them, rather than what it could do for the world of culture. And that led me to become a museum director in Middlesbrough, in the north of England as well, in a post-industrial town, which, again, was a place where people don't really like art. It's not part of the culture. So again, it's about making a museum work within its context, but also being international. And that's where I coined this idea of the useful museum, where I tried to get the museum to solve problems in the city. And that work then led me to Manchester to run the two major art museums, because everybody said, you can do this kind of work with people and making art work in social contexts, but you could never do it in a big city. You could never transform a large institution in this way. So for me, that was like a red rag to a bull. And so I said, okay, I'll take this on. And yeah, 5 years later, we transformed those museums. And 5 years on, I got the invitation to come here to ZKM to see if I could do something similar here. And that was a month ago. And I haven't managed to do anything yet.
Stefanie, Patruno, when you came to Karlsruhe, not so long ago, I think a year ago or so, was it a coming back to a region that you already know very well, or was it a completely new start for you?
Wenn es in Ordnung ist, würde ich hier für das Publikum direkt in Deutsch antworten. Die Städtische Galerie Karlsruhe, aber auch die Kunstszene im Süden Deutschlands. Und in Karlsruhe war mir sehr bekannt. Ich habe in Heidelberg studiert, Sie haben es anfangs gesagt. Und für mich war es allerdings auch sehr spannend, so viele Jahre später in diese Stadt zurückzukehren und festzustellen, dass sich sehr viel gerade ändert. Auch in den Institutionen, die Leitungen wechseln. Es ist ein frischer Wind und sehr viel Aufbruch in der Stadt. Und deshalb habe ich das Gefühl, dass ich genau zum richtigen Zeitpunkt am richtigen Ort bin. Und ich glaube, dass wir als Kulturinstitutionen in der Stadt gerade gemeinsam darüber nachdenken können oder das auch schon tun, welche Aufgabe unsere Museen mit ihren unterschiedlichen Profilen in den Begegnungen von Vergangenheit, Gegenwart und Zukunft haben. Und das ist, glaube ich, sehr, sehr spannend.
Welche Aufgabe wäre das denn für das Städtische Museum Karlsruhe?
Sie haben es ja kurz erwähnt, die Städtische Galerie Karlsruhe hat beherbergt die städtische Kunstsammlung mit mehr als 20.000 Arbeiten, die von der Romantik über die Moderne, die Nachkriegszeit bis in die Gegenwart reicht. Wir haben uns jetzt die Frage gestellt, im Kontext der anderen Institutionen der Stadt, was können wir in die Stadtgesellschaft auch reingeben? Wie können wir die Sammlung mit der Gegenwartskunst verbinden und aktivieren, um an unserem Ort die Gegenwart vor allem sprechen zu lassen. Das heißt, wir wollen einen Projektraum haben, um Künstlerinnen und Künstler einzuladen, verstärkt zeitgenössische neue Arbeiten für die Ausstellungsräume zu konzipieren und gleichzeitig Gegenwartskunst in den Dialog mit einer neuen Sammlungspräsentation zu geben.
Die Sammlung umfasst 20.000 Werke. Sie sind jetzt schon ein Jahr da. Haben Sie schon alle Werke gesehen? Schafft man das überhaupt?
Ja, das war ein sehr spannender Prozess. Wir werden jetzt das erste Mal im Sommer die Sammlung ganz neu präsentieren. Sie war teilweise die letzten 20, 30 Jahre chronologisch präsentiert. Wir werden jetzt die Sammlung in thematischen Räumen zeigen. Und in der Tat haben wir in diesem Zusammenhang ein großes Projekt mit allen 4 Kuratorinnen am Haus. Haben wir alle Werke unter die Lupe genommen, alle auch inventarisiert in unsere Datenbank und uns Themen herauskristallisiert, die an unsere Gegenwart anknüpfen. Fragestellungen, die uns alle beschäftigen in der Stadtgesellschaft Karlsruhe, aber auch darüber hinaus zum Thema Identität, Nachhaltigkeit, Rituale, Natur, aber auch Geschlechtergerechtigkeit und haben mal geschaut, was verbirgt sich in der Sammlung zu diesen Themen und wie kann ich da Brücken in die Gegenwart schlagen.
You are literally neighbors, having the same address in the same house. Would you say Städtische Galerie is part of the ZKM as a house, or how do you define your locations?
So at the moment we have 4 institutions in the building in which the ZKM is hosted, but we are a family or neighbors together, like a WG. We're living together there in the Hallenbau. So there is the Kunsthalle Karlsruhe, who is temporarily in the museum for the next 4 or 5 years, which has a collection that spans over 800 years of art history. We have the ZKM, which is very based on the future with media arts. And we have the Hochschule für Gestaltung, the HFG. So we have also a think tank of very young students in our building. And the Städtische Galerie Karlsruhe is more the contemporary art institution, but we are not really associated to the ZKM. I think it's really interesting that there are 4 very diverse institutions in one building and in one place in the city.
Alistair Hudson, what was your first contact or your first impression of the ZKM? Do you remember? How did it come to your attention as an institution?
Well, it was on my radar back when it first started.
Really?
At the end of the 1980s.
That was 89 or so, yeah.
When I was an art student, and we were aware of this thing growing, this idea, this phenomenon happening, and it was at the time when a lot of media art institutions were emerging because there was incredible excitement about the future of art and technology in art. And this was also, this was an exciting moment when a lot of these institutions were created. So I was aware of it then, and I've been over the years coming and going, seeing exhibitions since the Hallenbau was, was created in its form. But arriving here to work is very different.
New media was the magic word then when it opened, but new media is not new anymore. So maybe an idea of yours, what's new?
Yeah, well, obviously, new media art and media art itself is a contested term. So when
is a contested term?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It's people disagree over it.
Oh, okay.
About whether it's a thing anymore. Okay, so as I said, in the 1980s and 1990s, media art was a thing because nobody else was doing it. Now everybody is doing media art. We're all on our phones, we're making films, we're on the internet. In 89, we didn't really have the internet. We had dial-up connections. It's really early. But now this is the sea we're swimming in. So I think institutions like ZKM have to redefine themselves and evolve to adapt to a world where media is everywhere. and it's no longer the preserve of specialists in order to champion their cause. We have to think now ethically what we do with technology and media, and how a institution, a public museum, public institution, regulates and creates the best culture within this rapidly technological evolving world.
That's really interesting what you say, because that's something different from being a museum, like preserving and exhibiting things. But as I understand you, you really want to engage in or be an actor and somebody who is involved in what is happening in the present time. Can you talk about this a little bit more concrete?
Yeah, so I think for me, cultural institutions, public ones, should shape the kind of culture we want to live in.
That's an interesting sentence.
Yeah, but for me, that's the job.
Mm-hmm.
I look at, because things like politics, things like economics, the way we run the world, all comes from culture. Culture actually comes first. And this is something that was understood very recently in politics. When people talk about optics in politics, they talk about visuals. So this is actually understanding art in a different way. That actually, art isn't just the thing that comes at the end once you've made the money. Art is actually the way of living that we apply to everything we do in the world. So for me, ZKM shouldn't be a museum. It isn't a museum. It's more a laboratory. It's an experimental space. It's a like holistic institution, and that's why we have all these different institutions in the Hallenbau. It was actually designed to be that way, that it had an art school, that it had collections, that it did education, that it had laboratories, that it experimented, as well as creating a public space. And public spaces are very few and far between now. And so we have to use our public spaces as places to convene people to make culture better.
You have this expertise in convincing people to engage with the arts that would not bother. So this is very interesting. When you were talking about your biography a bit before, I thought here what we experience right now today, or the last few days, or what experiences everybody who is coming to this region of Germany, art is a very common thing. It's a given situation that art is there and it has its place in the lives of people, and it's something that does not have to be brought to people. So this is a totally different situation from where you came from. So what your task could be to activate people more from recepting art to somehow.
Yeah, well, I think that there's still a job to do in terms of keeping everybody on edge about what art is. So in one sense, in Germany, for example, there's a huge appetite for art. You see it here with so many people coming to the art fair. But this is one version of art. And I think the problem that we have right now, at this moment in human history, is we've had 200 years of one idea of what art is. There has really been one art world, which is painting and sculpture and latterly video art and many other things. But it's still something we describe very particularly as art. That's art, that's not. The reality is the world doesn't work like that. So it's not a question of whether something is art or not. It's a question of to what degree something is art. And I think if you start to think like that, it changes the way you see art working in the world. So art can be education, art can be politics, art can be architecture, it can be craft, design, it can be cooking, it can be gardening. This is all art. Art is applied to all these processes. And I think when you start to think of it like that, it actually is quite liberating. And it makes you do more exciting things, and it allows you to connect the idea of art with a much broader population and a broader diversity of cultures.
But isn't there a big fear that this angle on art can also be nivelating art? What is the nivellieren? Leveling down what art is?
No, I think it's leveling up.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, it makes it more interesting because it's actually how the world works. There is, the art world we see here is only relevant to the people who are here engaging in this type of art. People in Ghana, people in Indonesia, people in Mexico don't have the same viewpoint. And so what's really exciting is there are all these many different art worlds. That's the truth of it. And once you start to, it's not like saying, I don't want this kind of art anymore. It's saying we want this plus all the others. And that's actually more interesting. It's more exciting. It's a much more rich culture. Otherwise, you end up with a monoculture. Yeah. And that's not healthy.
Coming back to Stefanie, Patruno, what you said before, also I have the feeling that with revisiting the collection under certain aspects, you are probably also putting a new perspective on what we see as important in art. Could you give an example of your Sie haben schon ein paar Schlagworte genannt, unter welchen Aspekten. Es würde mich freuen, ein bisschen mehr zu hören, wie Sie diese Schlagworte vielleicht mit bestimmten Künstlerinnen, Künstlern, Jahrhunderten, Kunstwerken verknüpfen möchten. Einfach damit wir schon ein bisschen Appetit auf Ihre neue Präsentation bekommen und die neue Verknüpfung auch mit den Fragen der Gegenwart. Darum geht es.
Ich glaube, ich würde kurz nochmal einen Schritt zurückgehen und nochmal da anknüpfen, wo Alistair Hudson aufgehört hat, um dann den Bogen nochmal zu schlagen. Denn ich glaube, das, was uns verbindet und was vielleicht jetzt dieses Nachdenken, was das Museum als Institution heute sein kann oder was wir als Institutionen gemeinsam im Hallenbau sein können, davon ausgeht, wie man diesen Ort definiert. Und für mich ist Kunst oder das Museum vor allem ein Ort, der Fragen aufwirft, die Kunst, die Fragen aufwirft, die auch zum Staunen bringen kann, die zu Diskussionen, zu Vernetzungen, zum Austausch über Vergangenheit, Gegenwart, aber eben auch Zukunft sein kann. Also ein Ort, an dem diverse, multiple Perspektiven zugelassen werden. Also fast ein neutraler Raum, den wir bieten, um auch unterschiedliche Meinungen zuzulassen auf die Fragen, die die Kunst aufwirft und das auch auszuhalten, dass wir eine multiple Gesellschaft sind, die auch politisch unterschiedliche Ansichten haben und das mit der Kunst im Zentrum eben auch zu diskutieren und dazu ein Ort zu sein. Und deshalb haben wir uns versucht, mitten aus der Gesellschaft diese Themen herauszuschälen, also das Thema Identität. Da gibt es ein Porträt von Rembrandt beispielsweise. Also wir haben auch einen wunderbaren Schatz an alten Meistern, was kaum jemand weiß. Und dieses Selbstbildnis von Rembrandt, wie er sich im Spiegel sichtbar beobachtet und radiert, ist einer Fotografie von Thomas Ruff gegenübergestellt. Und so zu fragen, wer sind wir denn heute und wie hat auch der Blick des Künstlers in den Spiegel sich verändert von damals und heute. Wir schlagen den Bogen sozusagen bis zum Selfie und gehen so die verschiedenen Themen oder diese Brückenschläge, wie sich Kunst und Kunstmachen über die Jahrhunderte auch verändert hat. Thema Geschlechtergerechtigkeit. Wir haben einfach mal unter die Lupe genommen, wie viele Künstlerinnen sind denn eigentlich in unserer Sammlung? Wie hat sich denn der Ankauf von Werken von Künstlerinnen im Vergleich zu Künstlern seit unserem Bestehen, also seit rund 40 Jahren verändert? Und man sieht, Künstlerinnen sind mehr in der Sammlung geworden, aber es sind trotzdem nur insgesamt 13%. Und das wird sich auch im Ausstellungsraum mitteilen. Es werden nur Künstlerinnen gezeigt, auch vom 19. Jahrhundert bis in die Gegenwart. Marlène Dumas, Rosemarie Trockel und so weiter werden sozusagen im Dialog gezeigt. Und es ist auch spannend, wie wenig Künstlerinnen bisher Ausstellungen in unserem Haus gemacht haben. Es waren insgesamt, glaube ich, nur 2 Künstlerinnen, die bisher eine Einzelausstellung im Hallenbau hatten. Das ist wahnsinnig spannend und deswegen zeigen wir parallel dazu eine Sonderausstellung mit Werken von Ulla von Brandenburg, die das Thema Rituale nochmal aus unserer Sammlung aufgreift und in eine große Filminstallation übersetzt.
Hat Ulla von Brandenburg auch einen Karlsruhe Bezug? Erinnere ich das richtig?
Ja. Ulla von Brandenburg ist Professorin hier an der Akademie der Künste.
Okay. Mhm. I love it when we speak about artworks and artists, so I would like to come back to your idea of art being useful and being something that has a function, which is contrary to what we used to think like 200 years ago and until today, that art is the only thing in the world that has no function. And I would be really curious to hear a bit about the actual things that you do, for example, with Arte Util, the platform for useful art. How could such a usefulness, what do you do with art and what does the art with the people?
Yeah, well, it's probably worth reminding ourselves that the idea of art being useless is only a recent phenomenon, actually created in Germany by Immanuel Kant, by his philosophy prescribing this idea as art being separate from life. And of course that's not true. So for 40,000 years of human history, art was embedded in ritual, in religion, in craft and architecture and so on as well. So it's a recent idea, this idea of art being useless. And of course it's not, because of course people use art in their daily lives. If you by some of these pictures here, you are saying something about yourself. It is having an effect on you. It may be to give you power in the world. It may be to show how wealthy you are. It might be to send signals. There are all kinds of complicated reasons people use art. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to acknowledge that. And then in terms of useful art of the kind that I talk about, it's usually art projects that are seeking to have an impact in the world, to make some change happen. So they're usually a process, a thing that happens to make a change happen. So for example, I did a project with Tanya Bergera in Manchester.
She's a Cuban artist.
A Cuban artist who showed at Documenta, the last Documenta. And we ran a project called School of Integration. Okay. And we turned the museum into a school where rather than teaching migrants how to be English, people from all different cultures taught other cultures about their culture and shared it together. And what that did was to create a different kind of education system that now has a life and a different way of people understanding one another. So it had a practical outcome. It had a beneficial outcome to the project. It wasn't just a picture of something. It was actually doing something in the world. And a lot of this work revolves around education, around politics and activism, around design and architecture, around ecology, and actually artists working around the world to offer new solutions to ecological problems or scientific problems. And that's why for me ZKM is so interesting, because it was designed as a kind of digital Bauhaus. This was the founding principle, that it was about art and technology working together to make a contribution to the world, to shape the world. So for me, that's actually, that is being useful. And only on Friday morning, we had some visitors from the art fair come to ZKM, and I got talking to a tech investor from Los Angeles who'd been here to see the fair. And he was saying, we are really stuck in the world of technology because we have all these nerds working on software, working on artificial intelligence or KI, but they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to apply it. And that's why we like art and artists so much, is because that creativity we can then apply to these tools then gives it a real application in the world that works for people. So it's interesting, I always think, when you get scientists or medical clinicians coming to the world of art to say, you can really help us here and actually make what we do better. So I find that very exciting, and for me personally, I find that more exciting than just making exhibitions as pure entertainment.
I feel very optimistic right now after hearing what you say. No, really, because this is a really interesting way of turning things around and making art be the force that really applies to everybody, everywhere, in every situation somehow. So that's really nice. What a nice perspective, and what an interesting talk with you two. I thank you very much for giving me all this insight in your future plans. And wenn es Fragen aus dem Publikum gibt an Alistair Hudson oder Stefanie Patruno, dann hätten Sie jetzt die Gelegenheit dazu. No questions. Okay, so
we answered everything then.
I think you made us all very curious on your programs, and I'll be happy to come back and continue the conversation. So thank you very much for being here.
Dankeschön.